and thank you on this beautiful Friday afternoon for joining us. My name is Celeste Arrington. I'm the director of the GW Institute for Korean Studies, one of the organizers of today's event, and I'm also a political science and international affairs professor. It's a great honor to welcome everyone today and also to celebrate our third GWIC's core faculty book launch of the academic year. So we saved the best for last, I guess, right, Greg? It's also a pleasure to, again, through our great partnership with the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and with the Dean's office to promote the new research of our faculty. And I want to thank the co-sponsors, Seeger Center. Bruce Dixon is the director there. He will be moderating today's discussion, and also the Dean's Suite for promoting and highlighting the new research of faculty. So thank you, Alyssa. I will introduce you in a second. For these events, they would not happen without the dedicated staff of the Suite 503. So thank you, Adam, Habin, and many others for putting together the event. And so for official opening remarks to introduce Greg as well and his research, I will turn the mic over to our Dean of the Elliott School, Alyssa Ayers, who is a specialist also in Asia, South Asia. And so we're very glad that you could come and support this book launch today. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste, and welcome everyone. I want to echo the welcome on a wonderful, warm Friday afternoon. It's so great to be able to introduce yet another new faculty book. This is one of the best parts of being in a great school like the Elliott School. Our faculty produce groundbreaking research, and you will hear today how Greg is breaking new boundaries in the particular area he studies here, East Asia, China, and North Korea. Greg, his latest book, as you can see from the slide, is Cold War, Comrades, and Emotional History of the Sino-North Korean Alliance. This is a pretty unique title and a pretty unique framework for your research, and I'm excited to hear more about it. For all of you who don't know him already, Greg is Professor of History and International Affairs. Next year, he will mark his 25th year here at the Elliott School, so we will look forward to that. He is a foremost expert in U.S. East Asian relations and East Asian international history, and he is a longtime leader in Asian studies here at the Elliott School. He's previously served as the acting director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies and the GW Institute for Korean Studies, our two institutional partners today. Today, he is director of our Asian Studies MA program, and he also leads GW's Cold War research group. Despite all these administrative responsibilities, he continues to publish. He's got an amazing body of scholarship here. His research has led him to study the flow of commerce, of ideas and culture in East Asia, the Pacific, and beyond. He's published numerous popular and scholarly articles on this subject. He's won multiple fellowships that support his work, including a Fulbright Award, the Smith Richardson Foundation, and fellowships from the Woodrow Wilson Center. This is his third book, his third monograph. His first was Nation Building in South Korea, and that explored U.S.-South Korean relations during the Cold War. His second book, Winning the Third World, examined Sino-American rivalry during the Cold War. And this book kind of brings things together. With Cold War Comrades, Professor Brzezinski has penned what kind of brings the conversation together here. This book offers a new interpretation of the relationship between Beijing and Pyongyang. Greg is proficient in both Mandarin and Korean, and for his research, he's used previously unexamined Chinese and North Korean sources to show how mutual empathy, which is encouraged by both the PRC and the DPRK governments, help to shape political, military, and cultural interactions between the two socialist allies. And he argues that neither government would have survived as a socialist state without having this ideal of the Sino-North Korean friendship. Let me quote one of the reviews of his book. We're quoting Professor Andre Schmidt, who is author of North Korea's Mundane Revolution. Despite all the disputes, contradictions, and tensions that have shaped Sino-Korean relations, why have both countries so consistently spoken of their shared blood, mutual struggles, and common family ties? So in answering this question, Cold War Comrades brilliantly shows how emotion and culture deeply shape politics in the socialist world. Brzezinski's research in multinational archives pushes understanding of Sino-Korean alliance in new directions that scholars do not dare ignore. That is wonderful praise. Cold War Comrades is a tremendous history of Sino-North Korean relations, and it's a tremendous contribution to scholars and policymakers' understanding of this unique relationship and how it continues to influence the international relations of East Asia. We will hear first from Professor Brzezinski, who will speak, of course, about his book, and then we'll be joined by Professor Bruce Dixon, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and Director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies. And as you heard, he will be moderating a Q&A session. Few are better positioned to lead such a discussion with Greg, bringing on all of your knowledge of the region as well. So we have a lot of great insights to come. And with that, I turn the podium over to Professor Brzezinski. Congratulations on your newest book, and we look forward to hearing more.
I know. I'm so sorry. Here you go.
But yes, first of all, thank you to colleagues and students for coming. Thank you, Dean Ayers, for that great introduction. I'd like to thank the Seeger Center and the Institute for Korean Studies for helping to co-organize this. And I'd like to also thank the staff, including Adam and other staff members from the Institute for Korean Studies. Without them, these events just would not run smoothly at all. So I'm going to start my talk by mentioning or bringing up a hero from the Korean War. I think when we talk about the heroes of the Korean War in the United States, we tend to think about Douglas MacArthur or Matthew Ridgway. I'm going to talk about Ro Seung-jao, or as he's known in Korean, Ra Seung-gyo. He was a member of the contingent of Chinese volunteers, somewhere between, I think, 1.5 and 3 million Chinese volunteers who served in the Korean War between late 1950 and 1953. And just, a brief overview for those who don't know. This is, basically the course of the Korean War. North Korea was very successful in the initial stage in the summer of 1950, but after the Incheon landing in September of 1950, South Korea and the United States mount an effective counterattack and occupy most of North Korea over the autumn of 1950 before Chinese forces enter the Korean War in large numbers. They really start to pour in about December of 1950. And for a time, they actually recapture Seoul before the war once again becomes stalemated. But it's during these dark days for North Korea when it's still occupied by South Korean and American forces and being rescued by the Chinese volunteers, when Ro Seung-jao, who's serving in South Pyongan province in North Korea, which is not far from Pyongyang, hears a North Korean boy, Choi Young, calling for help somewhere in the distance. And so Ro Seung-jao races to the scene and dives into the icy water and repeatedly tries to push Choi Young out of the water. He pushes and pushes. He finally saves the boy, but he himself drowns in the effort. Now, it's a sort of dramatic story, And he actually is, for many years, he's been, sort of remained a hero in both China and North Korea. In North Korea, there's actually something called the Luoshengjiao River, and there is a plaque near it, which reads, it exhorts all of the people born within 3,000 miles of Korean territory to remember well our great friend Comrade Luoshengjiao and study his great internationalist spirit. And he, even as late as about 2011, when they were celebrating sort of the anniversary of China's entry into the Korean War, they even created Rasongyo Middle School. So, a lot of so his legacy hasn't been forgotten throughout the 1950s. You would have like Trey Yong himself would visit the parents, Luo Shengjiao's parents' house, and this would be sort of advertised or spoken about in Chinese state media, North Korean state media. But why him? Why did he become a hero? And I think war heroes often become war heroes not only because they're courageous on the battlefield, right? If you look at how wars unfold, a lot of people are very brave in fighting on the battlefield. A lot of people undertake heroic deeds. He wasn't a high-ranking general or a commander, but he did demonstrate certain virtues, certain traits that the Chinese state and the North Korean state were trying to promote. In particular, he sort of embodied the spirit of mutual empathy between China and North Korea that the Chinese Communist Party and the Korean Workers' Party were both trying to instill in their subjects at the time. He, on the one hand, through this courageous act of sacrificing himself for a North Korean child, demonstrated empathy and compassion towards North Koreans. But at the same time, for North Korea, he became a sort of object of North Korean empathy and a symbol of self-sacrifice. And as I've said, he's continued to be talked about. There have been movies about him in China and North Korea. There were comic books about him that were made during the 1980s and 1990s. Somebody gave me a couple of them once. They call this a research technique in China now garbology, because it's so hard to get into the archives. So, some of the interesting materials are picked up from random bookstores and other places. But what is empathy? Empathy is sort of a key part of the argument of the book. And so I want to give a basic definition by one of the psychologists who'd worked on it, Martin L. Hoffman, who says that it's the involvement of psychological processes that make a person have feelings that are more congruent with another situation than with one's own situation. So the idea is that if a Chinese citizen reads a newspaper about American bombs ravaging North Korean cities, they become angry and sad, even though they're safe in Shanghai or Beijing or wherever they are. And similarly, if a North Korean person hears about the suffering parents of a Chinese citizen who lost their child in battle, they become they feel that remorse, that pain. And so one of the key arguments of this book is that promoting this kind of mutual Sino-North Korean empathy was critical to both the Chinese Communist Party and the Korean Workers' Party between 1950 and 1965. And it was important, an important element in the survival of both the Chinese and North Korean states. And I think this mutual empathy was embodied in many ways by how Chinese and North Koreans talked about the relationship. This is sort of one of the most well-known Chinese phrases, Chinese ways of describing the relationship between China and North Korea, chun wang chi han. When the lips fall off, the teeth get cold. And one way to see that is from a sort of geostrategic perspective, right? If North Korea falls, then China could be more easily exposed to invasion or attack from a potentially hostile, democratic, unified Korea. But there's also another way of understanding this as well that says that China and North Korea are interconnected, and that pain, if one of them feels pain, the other will feel pain as well. So this is, this is sort of how I read it. And the book, I take a lot of this rhetoric seriously. Some people say, oh, it was just, propaganda. Did people really believe it? To what extent? It's hard to know, but I think propaganda and these kinds of idioms are useful because at a minimum, they tell you what the state and the party wanted people to believe. Now, a lot of the other literature on relations between China and North Korea, I call it the clashes school, because it puts a lot of emphasis on arguments and disagreements that emerged between Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung, between the Chinese leadership and the North Korean leadership. And there were disagreements between the two, to be clear. There were disagreements between Mao and Kim Il-sung over strategy during the Korean War. They had a rather big disagreement over de-Stalinization in 1956. And people, other scholars, especially among the most famous, Professor Shen Zhihua in China, but also some scholars in the United States, some of whom are good friends of mine, such as Mitch Lerner, Patrick McEachern, they've tended to argue that the entire relationship was basically filled with tensions from the beginning to the start. And I would tend to agree that sometimes frictions were there, though I think that this literature also overstates the level of frictions. Some of the people, such as the Chinese scholars, grew up in this environment where they were constantly taught to love North Korea. So when they found evidence that there were some disagreements, I think they approached it and sort of said, this must have been the real thing. This was what was really going on. And I think that's useful, but I don't agree that it was the only thing that was going on and that it characterized the entire relationship between either China and North Korea or between Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung. There were also a lot of tender and friendly moments between these two. And I would say, regardless of what the relationship was like between the leaders, publicly, it was always represented like this. China and North Korea as eternal friends and allies who fought together during the Korean War, who shed blood together, and were eternally linked by different kinds, by their shared experience of revolution and war against Japanese imperialism and later against American imperialism, as they like to call it. Why did this become so important? I think you have to think back about where China and North Korea were at the time of the Korean War. Both were new states, and both were very much in need of unifying ideas. So North Korea itself is inaugurated in September of 1948 after it denied the UN Committee on Elections in Korea access. And China, the PRC as we know it, was of course formally inaugurated in October 1949 after the civil war between the Kuomintang and the CCP. But at the time, they don't know. Nobody knows that 70, 80 years later, these two states are still going to be around, right? In China, of course, dynasties came and went. And in Korea, this was sort of the creation of two separate states was a condition that nobody knew how stable it could be or how long it would last. But they both needed to strengthen popular commitment to their state objectives. In China and to a lesser degree in North Korea, there were a lot of anti-campaigns, right? The anti-revisionist campaign, the five antis, the three antis in China, and all of that was good. They sort of knew who they were trying to get people to be against, but there's also the issue of what are they for? What do they believe in? And that was where I think Sino-North Korean friendship played an important role. And I think creating emotions that were congruent with Sino-North Korean friendship, most particularly mutual empathy, would become an important basis of political rule. And I think, on the book's cover, I say the two states would not have survived. That may be a little bit of an overstatement, right? But I do think it was part of the basis for political rule in both the Korean Workers' Party and for the CCP. It was important because it helped to influence emotions of peoples in both countries, both among their leaders and the general population. So how is this book broken down? In the book itself, I try to show how the ideals of Sino-North Korean friendship and the accompanying emotions of mutual empathy, and I also talk about something that I call revolutionary sentimentalism in the book, which I'm not going to talk about as much during today's talk, but I talk about how they were used to mobilize emotions in both states and to influence the feelings of different groups in both countries. And I've divided it basically into 4 chapters. The first focuses on the leaders. What were Mao Zedong and Kim Il-sung doing during the 50s? What were their meetings like? It focuses on sort of the emotional currents of some of the high-level meetings, and it talks about what the leaders themselves did to promote mutual empathy. The second, and you got a taste of that in the beginning, the second chapter focuses on Chinese volunteers during the Korean War, and they were in North Korea not only during the Korean War, but they don't leave until 1958. They play an important role in reconstructing North Korea in the 5 years after the war. And so I look at the relationship between the volunteers and the North Korean people. The third chapter focuses on sort of lower level party cadres, which included everything. What a cadre, there's been a lot of efforts to define the term, but it has a pretty wide meaning in both China and North Korea, and it encompasses everything from journalists to factory managers to all other sorts of related people working in the government, all propagandists, a lot of different roles. The fourth chapter, which if I'm going to see how I do on time, I may give you a hint of what's in the fourth chapter as well, which focuses on cultural performers and exchanges and how cultural exchanges were used to inspire different emotions in both China and North Korea. And then, of course, a lot of people say, well, but what is the relationship between China and North Korea like today? Where's the mutual empathy today? And the final chapter, I focus on sort of the decline, not really the decline of Sino-North Korean friendship, but I would say more the change, how it changed between the 1970s and 1990s, and why while it remained important, it was not as critical to China and North Korea as it was during their period of socialist state building in the 1950s and 1960s. So I'm going to talk first about talk about the chapter on the volunteers a little bit. because I think that's something that most people know about, that, there were these Chinese volunteers who served who fought in the Korean War and were, had a powerful presence in North Korean life. They were, of course, led by the commander Peng Dehuai. And it's sort of an interesting composition because on the one hand, you have some people who had served in Mao's armies during the Chinese Civil War against the Kuomintang, but you also had some people who had been fighting against the communists during the Chinese Civil War and sort of were eventually incorporated into the Chinese into Chinese communist forces. And I think for a time their loyalties were still sort of in doubt. Some of them, I think the evidence that we have says some of them just did it out of pragmatism because they knew they were losing and they didn't want to die. But then there were some of them who were genuinely attracted to the way Mao's armies conducted themselves. But I think a key question is, how do you motivate the volunteers to fight a better equipped enemy? This was a key issue for China. And I think there was a lot that, I think one of the key ways was to try to influence their emotions and try to inspire them with an appropriate way of thinking and feeling about North Koreans. And one of the ways that they did this was through speeches and rhetoric. Both China and North Korea were countries that were, rooted in cults of personality, where the leader is sort of a great leader, and you read their writings, and they're sort of they sort of play extraordinary roles in the politics of the parties and the countries. Mao Zedong really did use rhetoric to try to influence the volunteers and how they should act. One of his well-known sayings was, the Chinese comrades must regard the affairs of Korea as the same as their own affairs, right? So what is happening in North Korea should affect you. You should feel it, right? And educate their commanders and their fighters to cherish the hills, river, trees, and flowers of Korea. And what I think is important, what's sort of interesting about this, is you can tell that he's really aiming for a broad audience, because a typical Chinese volunteer at the time probably didn't recognize thousands of Chinese characters, right? But for those of you who've studied Mandarin, right, when you get to first year Chinese, right, what are the first characters that you learn? Yishan, Yishui, Yicao, Yimu, right? And so the simplicity and the repetitiveness of that was something that the volunteers could, even volunteers who weren't as well educated could easily grasp and internalize. And when you read a lot of memoirs of Chinese volunteers, a lot of them do remember this. They say, I remember that Mao told us to cherish every blade of grass, and every hill in Korea. There was also something that was a common practice in the Chinese Communist Party known as political work, which included a wide range of activities, including propaganda pamphlets, special training courses, and cultural production. And it included emotional work. And so this is sort of typical propaganda from communist China aimed at the volunteers at the time. And you can see at the top they have the Chaoshan Renmin, right? This is the North Korean people depicted as being sort of virtuous and innocent. And then you have the American bandits who are invading North Korea, but they're repulsed by Kangme Yuanchao, which means resist America, aid Korea. And so this was one way that it was represented, with the effort to create a specific kind of impact, emotional impact on the volunteers, and influence how they saw things. During the Chinese Civil War, Mao had put forward something known as the 3 main rules of discipline and 8 points of attention. And I do not remember all of the 3 main disciplines and 8 points of attention off the top of my head, but they included things like don't hit the local people, don't rape the women, provide aid, try to demonstrate patience. So this was also something that had been developed during the Chinese Civil War, and it was reinvigorated to a large degree during the Korean War. And there were sort of a lot of other mechanisms as well. Another way that they tried to inculcate empathy towards North Koreans was through war songs. And this book is actually a Chinese songbook from the Korean War era. And it literally means songs to protect peace. And I found this, there's actually some interesting collections at the National Archives. During the Korean War, there were a number of North Korean documents and propaganda materials. They didn't capture a lot of Chinese policy documents about the war because they didn't actually invade and attack Beijing as MacArthur wanted. That's embarrassing. The telemarketers can't escape them. But they actually captured these songbooks from from China and North Korea during the war. And inside the book, well, this was one of the most famous songs, which is the Korean War March. And you can see that the song, it again really embodies some of these emotions that the Chinese state was trying to inculcate. The hearts of the Chinese and Korean people are connected. Sino-Korean friendship for thousands of years. The Chinese People's Army and the North Korean and the Korean People's Army, we are one family. We both bear the people's trust and protect the army of peace. So you can sort of see how it was represented at the time. And I would just say that just as promoting a sense of sympathy towards North Koreans among the volunteers was important to the CCP, it was also important to North Korea to promote this kind of empathy towards the volunteers. If you look at, North Korea doesn't have a huge population at the time. And the way the volunteers, the volunteers don't set up huge military bases in North Korea the way that the US would eventually do in South Korea. Instead, Chinese volunteers often needed to live a lot, like they would sometimes station themselves or take up residence with North Korean peasants and families. And at the time, volunteers were up to 7% of North Korea's population, right? If you count about 1 million or 2 million Chinese volunteers and a population in North Korea of about 15 to 20 million, a pretty significant number are volunteers. And you could see, you could see the way the North Korean state made efforts to try to influence sentiment towards the Chinese. And this is also something that comes from the captured documents collection at the National Archive. What's interesting here is the date, 1950, December 3rd, right? So North Korea, a lot of it was still under sort of US UN ROK occupation at the time. And as soon as the North Korean state gets its wherewithal and its act together, it publishes Chosun Inmingun, which is the official newspaper of the North Korean army. And you can see how it's trying to influence sentiment. It's like 우리들이 공동적 미제를 bande hayo sau는 형제적 천우이다. So 형제적 means like a brotherly fellow, a brotherly comrade or brotherly fellow fighter, right? So this was an important this was an important aspect of how North Korea tried to acclimate North Koreans to the fact that all of a sudden there were 7 million there were 1 million or more Chinese volunteers living in their country, living with them, eating with them, etc., etc. So I think I am going to have a little time. I will have time to talk about the other chapter, which deals with culture during the Korean War and cultural exchanges. And I want to start this out. I want to talk about this by bringing up another sort of influential Chinese well, I wouldn't say actress, performer named Wang Wenzhen. And I think she also has a very interesting story. She was among the most famous performers of the Yue opera in her time. And I think the difference between this and the Peking opera is that all of the performers are female. So women play the women's roles and women also play the men's roles. And during the Korean War, they needed to sort of entertain the Chinese volunteers. And so just as they sort of they used to send Bob Hope or other comedians to visit the troops during various wars. During the Korean War, China sent down some of its best known performers, and she was one of the ones who was sent down. She was sent to North Korea in 1953 while the war is still ongoing, and her troupe performed two well-known Chinese plays, The Butterfly Lovers and The Story of the West Chamber. She performed under pretty challenging circumstances. You can read her memoirs, and one of the things she talks about is how they would perform in theaters that had been dug into the ground. As you know, during the war, North Korea, because it was being bombed so heavily by the United States, it had actually created this elaborate network of underground tunnels. And so she performed, and she describes how there were American planes dropping bombs right, overhead, and you could hear the theater would be shaking while they were performing, but it did create this sense of sort of kindredship and camaraderie between the Chinese performers. And a lot of times what they did and what was done to create fraternal feelings between Chinese performers and North Korean performers was that they would also work on sort of joint productions that Chinese and North Korean performers were involved in. And one of the things that the North Koreans thought of when they heard about, when they saw the story of the Butterfly Lovers and the story of West Chamber, they said, this really reminds us of a popular North Korean traditionally it's a pansori, which is a traditional kind of music. But by the 1940s, it was also being performed in plays, and there's been movies about it as well, known as chunhyang. And the North Korean performers said, well, you should learn about chunhyang. And it was, I think in North Korean productions of it at the time, there was a sort of a socialist element, right? It emphasized the story's inherent critique of feudalism and the old order. For those of you who don't know about Chunhyang, it basically tells the story of a courtesan who falls in love with a scholar and someone of noble, someone, I guess, of noble heritage. And it deals with sort of a lot of related class issues to it. Chunhyang, who's the heroine, is forced to suffer when her lover is temporarily sent away. Um, but many Chinese writers became interested in the story during the Korean War. For instance, Ba Jin, who was a well-known Chinese writer, was also and a well-known Chinese novelist, was also sent down to North Korea to report from the front lines. And he watched it and wrote about it and used it as a sort of way to promote sympathy towards North Korea. And so eventually what happens is there is a Yue opera version of Chunhyang. And in order to create this, of course, this was designed to sort of create mutual empathy in a number of ways, or was supposed to. On the first, the first dimension of this was that it required for the Chinese performers to learn about Chunhyang, this North Korean play, and for them to sort of get a sense of how it was performed in its tradition. It sort of demanded that they collaborated and worked very closely together with the North Korean performers. And the North Koreans were also very enthusiastic about teaching the play to the Chinese. There were even, a couple of episodes where they had to find older copies of Chunhyang and how it was performed, and they would sort of, look, search through the rubble that had been created by American bombs to create this. But they worked together. They did eventually create the Yue opera version, but it was also designed to create mutual empathy because the performers themselves were expected to really learn the emotions and the feelings of their characters. And so these Chinese performers were being told, or in some ways voluntarily, trying to really inhabit the emotions of Chunhyang as she underwent these various travails in the course of the story. And this is sort of a scene from it. Obviously, this is not from the 1950s and 60s, but it's been pretty durable. It's not one of the main parts of the retinue of the Yue opera today, but you still do occasionally see Yue opera performances of it. You can, if you type in Chunxiang in Chinese characters instead of the Korean version, you'll probably come across some of them. And it did become very popular in China at the time. Zhou Enlai was actually a fan of it, and he praised it. And so what they also did was they invited North Korean drama troupes to China, and they would tour major cities and perform Chumhyang and another traditional Korean story, Shimchang. And these performances were, by most accounts that you can see, Chinese and North Korean, very popular. And this is this is a very grainy picture. It's the best I could get. But when the North Korean performers returned home, and this is how I got, some sense of it, they actually wrote about it very extensively in North Korean journals. And, again, when you get to this kind of source, some people say, well, how sincere were they? Were they just writing this to get published? But I think what's important, one of the things they would describe is how the Chinese audiences were moved to tears. And you would also, if you read like Renmin Ribao at the time, you would also have a lot of Chinese writers who saw these performances describe how, they saw this North Korean drama and it represented the real art and inner beauty of the North Korean people. And they would also describe how they were, being moved to tears. And Chunhyang is only one example. There were a lot of other different kinds of cultural exchanges that I cover in the book. But what I argue is that whether every person in the audience was actually crying is less important than what the emotional norms were. Chinese audiences were expected to cry, and culture was thus another important mechanism to try to disseminate and, in some ways, enforce the emotional norms of the alliance. So that's what I cover in, it's not the only thing I cover, but it's one of the things I cover in the cultural section. So ultimately, what do I think the significance of this is? I think there's a few things. First of all, there was a pattern for Sino-North Korean relations during the Cold War that was important. I think there could be clashes between the leadership, but the public knowledge of them was very limited. And the general sense that was given to the public throughout the Korean War and during the 1950s and 60s was that Chinese and North Koreans were friends or should be friends, and that you should empathize with them. Second, as I've said, I think it played a critical role in consolidating both the Chinese and the North Korean states. By the end of the Korean War, they were both fairly poor, but a lot fewer people were questioning whether these two states would actually survive, right? And of course, by 1965, which is the end of the period that I cover in the book, a lot of the rest of the world was by then saying, well, we better learn to deal with China and to a lesser extent North Korea as they are. And so this would pave the way for slow changes in US policy towards China in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Finally, I would say one thing, in terms of how I see the relevance to the policy community. I think since I've been in Washington, I've constantly heard like, well, China's a responsible stakeholder and it's going to help us on North Korea. And, what could we do to stir up tensions between China and North Korea? And, even when some Chinese scholars and journalists called for China to abandon North Korea, right? There was all of this excitement in the media. China is going to abandon North Korea, and that's going to be the end of them. And I always said, no, that's not going to happen. Don't count on it. I think North Korea and the Korean War and China's relationship with it has been a critical part of the Chinese legitimacy narrative. And so I think it's one that is not as influential today as it was, but I think it's still too influential for us to ever see a day where China ever completely abandons North Korea. And I think if we look at the way things have been going recently with the two moving closer together once again, you can see that that's really the main pattern that's been followed. So I'm going to end there. I describe a lot of these arguments and events and case studies, I could call them, not really case studies, but some of the themes that I talk about are all I describe all of them in much greater detail in the book. So if you want to see it in more depth, then feel free to purchase the book. But I'll end there, and I think now I'm going to be interrogated by Bruce.
So as a reminder, and for those of you who came in late, my name is Bruce Dixon. I'm the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, one of the co-sponsors for today's event. So Greg, I want to thank you for the book. I don't always enjoy reading academic books, but I really did enjoy reading this one. So that was a real treat.
I don't know if this is on. I don't.
And they both, it's not working. It's working 5 minutes ago.
Doesn't sound like it. Well, we can go back and forth. So as a softball question to get started, tell us about the inspiration behind the book. What made you research and write this book?
Sort of an interesting question. I would say I owe the book that I'm now writing to the Smith Richardson Foundation on Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and have owed it to them for a long time. And I was getting set to write it, and I ran into someone named Frank Castigliola one day in the National Archives, and he said, I'm writing a book about, and now I think this mic is also is working. They're turning the volume. Okay. Thank you. So he said, I'm just writing a volume on emotions and diplomacy, and I wonder if you could somehow give me a chapter on East Asia. And at first I was like, well, that's, I haven't really focused anything on emotions before, but I'll go home and think about it. And so, and I realized, like, when I wrote my prior book on Sino-American rivalry in the Third World, I collected a lot about Africa and Southeast Asia, but I couldn't resist the documents about North Korea. So I had a lot of materials from China about China's North Korea policy from the Foreign Ministry archive. And I said, well, if I use some of these documents about North Korea, all of this, highly sentimental rhetoric, it just suffuses these documents. So why don't I, write this chapter for Dr. Castigliola? He's Asianists won't know him, I guess, but he's a well-known historian of U.S. foreign relations who's written a lot of books about the role of emotions in U.S. foreign policy. And so I wrote the chapter, and then I said, well, this is interesting. There's tons of sources on this that haven't been looked at. And I made I made a few more trips to China in 2016. By then, the Foreign Ministry archive was closed, but the provincial archives had not been closed yet. And so I was able to go to Shanghai Municipal Archives, Beijing Municipal Archives, and I have a lot of friends in China who also were able to occasionally give me useful materials. And so this just came together as not just a chapter, but a book. And it eventually grew into a book. I thought it would actually go a lot faster. I had about 80% of it written in 2020, as I like to say, in March of 2020. And then I spent about a year transforming my classes so that they would be successful online. And then I spent 2 years doing what you're doing and directing the Seeger Center. And so, which was a great experience, but I didn't have a great amount of time to sort of just write that last 20%. But I finally had sabbatical in 23, 24 and finished it. So.
One of your bold claims in this book is that if it weren't for this relationship between China and the North Korea, neither regime would have survived. And you tried to back off a little bit in your talk, but I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. So, I mean, imagine the counterfactual if the Korean War had not broken out. Would the two new regimes really be in jeopardy?
Well, I think I think the Korean War is critical to the legitimacy narratives of both countries. Number one, I'll start with North Korea, where so much of their guiding ideology, yes, it's based on Juche and worship of Kim Il Sung, but also the fact that they had stood up to the world's greatest power at the time. And I think the same with China as well. I think the Korean War was a tremendous boost to China's prestige, to the prestige of the Chinese Communist Party nationally and also internationally. So, I don't work quite like a political scientist where I try to isolate like the variable, the independent variable and the dependent variable. But I do think it was critical to how the two new states cemented or gained the loyalty of a lot of their population. And I think the idea of Sino-North Korean friendship was a key part of it, because both China and North Korea, they knew what they were fighting against, sure, but what were they fighting for? There needed to be some positive basis underneath it all. So that's why I believe it's, you can't completely prove or disprove a counterfactual, but if you look at how North Korea and China have legitimated themselves and how they did so, especially between 1950 and 1965, which were the years of most, I would say, the years of most frenzied socialist state building in both countries. I think things would be quite different without the Korean War.
Okay, great. One last question before we open up to the more general Q&A. When I read the subtitle, "An Emotional History," I wasn't quite sure what I was going to get. And often, at least from the Chinese side, Chinese language often has kind of emotional character to it that often seems unusual to Western ears. So how do you distinguish kind of the cultural norms of language from, actual true emotions and behavior?
Right. Well, I would say I think most scholars of emotions would argue that that's kind of a false binary, and that emotions are always culturally mediated to some degree. And I would say, though, to be fair, like the term, I'm sort of using empathy as a shorthand for the way Chinese and North Koreans express themselves, because they didn't, the term empathy itself didn't take on its current meaning until maybe the 60s and 70s. So I'm sort of using it to describe a range. I'm sort of using it to describe the more general tendency in China and North Korea that you really needed to, or the general ideal that Chinese should feel the suffering and share the joys of North Koreans, and that North Koreans should do the same for Chinese. I'm okay. This same telemarketer has been calling nonstop. Sorry about that. I should have put "do not disturb," but I'm sorry. I was so that's part of, I think that's part of the answer. And I think, though, I also try in the book to use some. Okay, I'm going to try to put this on "do not disturb" finally, because I don't know what this telemarketer, like, why they're calling so urgently. But usually
While you're doing that,
is enough. But
well,
yeah,
open it up and
yeah, I didn't completely answer that, but I'll
maybe someone else will come back
that's
to it.
fine.
So three
A lot of-
three directions as the Q&A begins. One, wait for a microphone to come to you. Second of all, identify who you are so the rest of us know who's asking the question. And thirdly, you only get one question. I took three, but I'm a co-sponsor. You're here for free. You get one question, and please make it short, not a full speech. Greg, I'll let you call the.
who should let's start with Jim.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Jim Hirschberg from the History Department and the Elliott School. Jim Hirschberg from the Elliott School and the History Department, colleague of Greg's for a quarter century, more or less. Looking forward greatly to the book. Congratulations. Like Bruce, I'm a bit skeptical on the criticality to the survival of what you're saying, not so much to North Korea, but to China. I mean, I am prepared to deal with my skepticism when I read. I want to ask one and a half questions. One quick terminological point. For decades, scholars and other sources have ridiculed the term volunteers to describe the Chinese forces, simply saying Mao is somehow trying to minimize the risk of an all-out PRC U.S. war. He was deeply worried, as shown in his October 2nd, 1950 letter to Stalin, and he simply used the word volunteers, but that they were not volunteers in any real sense. You seem to take that much more seriously. The second question is, in terms of the emotionality of this relationship, how would you compare it to what many would argue is a far more significant in concrete economic terms, the Chinese attitude towards Soviet aid in the mid 1950s? Did it lack the emotionality that you're talking about? Because it would seem that it was far more central to the development of China's and the PRC's industrial economy, society, in terms of the scale of advisors and training and education and money it received prior to the split by the late 1950s. Thank you.
Okay, so yes, two good questions. I think first of all on the volunteers, I'm not really disagreeing with that. I mean, I think they most of I mean that's right. They were called volunteers because it was Mao's way of saying we're not declaring war on the United States, but we have these communist or socialist volunteers who are going to assist their revolutionary comrades in North Korea because they also aided them during the Chinese Civil War. And so when you talk, and so that's also a point though, when you talk about, the criticality of the China-North Korea relationship to China, that was, North Korea's service as a rear area to China during the Chinese Civil War. That in and of itself was important to China's victory during the Civil War. But I'm not disagreeing with your terminology, with what the volunteers actually were. I think, I think for the what I'm trying to show in this book is, in fact, yes, there was some coercive element. Yes, you had many people who had been Kuomintang forces who served who were in the volunteers, and some of their loyalty was questionable, and they did surrender, and they went to the POW camps, and after they were in the POW camps, they went to Taiwan instead of being repatriated. So the question I'm more asking is, how did China deal with that, and how did it, motivate most of the volunteers to keep fighting? So that's one thing I would say, and then what was the second question? So comparing to, yes, see, I think the China-North Korea relationship is unique in that regard. I think one, looking at what happened, I mean, you had the Sino-Soviet border clashes, and China and the Soviet Union calling each other enemies for a while. And I honestly couldn't imagine that happening between China and North Korea. But I also think the language and the tone of the language that China and North Korea used to talk about each other was qualitatively different than how they talked about the Soviets. If if you look at Chinese sources, and if you look at North Korean sources as well, they admired the Soviet Union in a lot of ways, but the sentimental attachment was more towards China. And during the Sino-Soviet split, of course, North Korea would lean more heavily towards China, although maybe not completely. And you can explain part of it is that, well, North Korea was just playing them off against each other. And I buy that to a certain degree. But if you look at what they were saying, I think there's also a cultural commonality between them, and a sort of shared sense of resistance to Japan and the United States, that builds this basis of mutual empathy between them. And I don't think that exists between China and the Soviet Union to the same degree, even though, yes, when it came to who China received economic aid from, it was definitely much more the Soviet Union than it was North Korea. But I think there were also a lot. There was more binding China and North Korea together in the end, even though the relationships were very different. Let me call on Albert San, my Japanese classmate for several years.
Yeah, I'm Ethan, an undergrad at Asia Studies and Greg's former student and classmate as well. My question is kind of building off the previous one in that why do we see such an emotional connection with the Sino-North Korean relationship when we have similar echoing revolutions via the Pathet Lao and Viet Minh, but not that same emotional connection between Vietnam, Laos, and China?
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right that I think China was very sympathetic towards the revolutions in Laos and the Viet Minh. It aided the Viet Minh, and the relationship was fairly close between the CCP and the Viet Minh for a while. But I would also say that the Viet Minh always had a little bit more of an independent, I don't know if I would say independent streak, a hostile streak towards Chinese influence and overbearingness than the North Koreans had. And so that might be part of it. The blood and treasure that China expended on behalf of the Viet Minh or the Pathet Lao was nothing in comparison to the blood and treasure that it expended during the Korean War. And so while there was certainly, if you look at Chinese media during the time, they'd never say any bad things about the Viet Minh or the Pathet Lao. There's a lot of support for them, but it tends to be more standard revolutionary rhetoric and less of the struggles of the suffering Pathet Lao should move us to tears. So that's how I would that's how I would characterize the difference. And again, I think it involves sort of the combination of shared history. There's more. I think there's more in I think from the start that China and North Korea have probably more in common with each other culturally and historically than China has with Vietnam or Laos. So I think that combination of things is how I would explain it. So thank you for your question. Yes.
Hi, Professor. My name is Dongil, and I'm a PhD student at University of Maryland. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I have one question about what degree of the history education contributed to make this certain type of the emotions. So especially the Sumang Chihan, I forget the Chinese pronunciation. I'm so sorry. So the Koreans and Chinese shared the historical narratives that the Ming Dynasty, pre-modern Chinese dynasty, rescued the Joseon Dynasty from the Japanese invasion during the 16th centuries and 17th centuries. So did these two communist states try to excavate this historical fact, or they try to make distance from this feudal dynasty as a modern communist state?
Right. And I think you may have studied this in more detail than I have, but I would say much more the latter, that they tried to distance themselves from it. One, because North Korea, the last thing that it wants to be seen as is sort of reenacting a new version of Sade, right? Which is something that, the North Koreans were very critical of. And the Chinese leadership as well were very much trying to make the case that China had entered a new era with Mao Zedong and socialist revolution that would be different and set aside from the feudal past, and that they were now going to have fraternal relations with other socialist countries, and they weren't going to have any kind of tributary system or anything like that. So that's how I would argue that. I do think if you look at how they both teach the history of the Korean War, there's some commonalities, some differences. I would just say, while you're talking about history teaching, one of the interesting things is that, of course, if you read North Korean history textbooks, the North Korean role is a little bit greater and the Chinese role is a little bit smaller. And if you read Chinese history textbooks, the Chinese role is a little bit greater and the North Korean role is a little bit smaller. But I think it doesn't cause that much tension between them a lot of the time. The Chinese sort of understood that, how North Koreans were representing things, and in some ways they would even encourage it in some meetings. One thing is that when it came to building socialism, North Korea was actually faster than China in certain elements. A lot of people don't recognize this, but during the 50s and 60s, North Korea was often looked at as sort of a model, as an exemplar of socialist development. And so, Zhou Enlai and Chinese officials would be like, you guys are so great. You're amazing. You're going to be the first to achieve this. So, sometimes they even, fed North Korea's ego on some of these issues. So, yes, Min.
Thanks, Greg. Min Jung Kim, I'm a faculty here at the LU School. It's a fascinating argument, often under-examined in security relationship between the two states. Looking forward to reading your book. My question is regarding to your last remarks about the implication of this relationship in contemporary setting. You mentioned that there's a new resurgence of relationship under the pretext of CRINCs, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea getting together. Do you see some sort of similar mechanisms being engineered? I asked this because the strategic context is very different back in the 1950s, and now they're not really looking for state survival, but they're in a different situation, highly isolated, trying to make friends. So I just want to hear your thoughts on whether the similar mechanisms being replicated.
Right. I mean, I think you're right that the strategic environment is obviously very different than it was during the 1950s, and that now, there's sort of been a coalescing between China, North Korea, and Russia. But I do find it interesting that they're acting in unison, almost the way they did during like the early 50s, which was sort of the high point of the China, North Korea, Russia relationship. So I would certainly say the strategic context was different. What do I think the enduring significance of this is, though? When China and North Korea need to move closer together again, or when they do, this rhetoric is very, very useful to sort of get popular backing, right? When they, because it's just, it's very easy for them to slip back into this. Welcome back to China, our traditional long-standing ally who fought alongside us in the Korean War. And so if you read what Chinese say today, it does bear resemblance to that. The other thing that's sort of interesting is, a lot of this stuff that I talk about in the book, it hasn't died. So for instance, during the 1950s, there was something known as the Kim Il-sung class in China, right? Where, they were supposed to emulate the leadership and example of Kim Il-sung. And it still exists. And so if you read like the PLA newspaper, you'll still see that they talk about North Korea in these very, in very much the same way that they were talking about it in the 1950s and 1960s. And, similar, if you read sort of, there's, I don't know how to describe them, but there's sort of a group now in China that sort of calls for the reinvigoration of traditional communist ideas, and Xi Jinping is sort of part of this to some degree. But they, a lot of the things they post on their like website and things like they continue this rhetoric. So that's how that's part of how I see the contemporary relevance of this. So yes, I had another thought about that, but it slipped my mind. So yes, Leah.
Thank you. Lee Hong, history PhD at the George Washington University, and thank you very much, Professor, for giving us such a great talk. And your story about Luo Shenjiao really brought me back to my primary school when I actually learned the text. So yeah, that story actually exists at least during early 2000s in Chinese textbook. That was still there. So my question is about like who because you focus a lot on emotions, right? So my question is on whose emotion, right? So is that the regime's emotion or it's people's emotion? Because if we look at a very similar story between China and North Vietnam, right? We have a very similar story that China and Vietnamese was trying to develop this discourse that they are revolutionary friends, and I'm pretty sure similar stories like Luo Shenjiao happens in Vietnam during the 60s and 70s. But then the relationship between China and Vietnam broke up in 70s, and then suddenly the discourse changed. So do you think like this emotion was led by the CCP or like the Korean Party, or it's mainly led by the people who actually share and experience it? So
Right. I think that's a good question. And I developed these ideas in more detail in the book. And so I wasn't sure whether to lean more into the theoretical basis of the book or into the more China, North Korea elements of the book. And I'm in DC, so I decided to go for the more China, North Korea elements. But I do develop my argument about emotions more in the book. And in particular, some of the most recent literature on the history of emotions. In particular, there's an anthropologist, William Reddy, whose idea of emotional regimes was influential to me in how I sort of approached this book. One of the key and interesting arguments that he makes is that if you continuously repeat and perform certain emotions, eventually, in many cases, you do genuinely start to feel these emotions. And it goes back to an earlier study of sort of flight attendants, and they were, who are always being told that they have to smile for customers and things like that. And they found that over time, they became happier or felt happier from performing these emotions all the time. So that's why, one of the things is that a lot of people think there's sort of some distinction between what people say and what they feel. And a lot of the literature on emotions has recently argued that it's not such a neat, you can't make such a neat division between the two. And so part of the argument is that when leaders were saying these things, it was also influencing how they felt to a degree. And so that's part of the reason why I acknowledged Kim and Mao had their share of frictions, but I also think that there were a lot of sort of very, genuinely friendly and intimate moments between them. And they're really like sort of a slightly dysfunctional family that love each other sometimes and hate each other sometimes. But it could be both. But then I would say it's really about they're trying to spread these emotional norms throughout the society. And so what I'm doing in the book is trying to show, how did they disseminate it among leaders and then party cadres. And then the chapter on culture is sort of the one that I think best gets at how it impacts, how they try to influence the masses. But there are some limits. Like I can't know what every single Chinese or North Korean actually felt during the 1950s or 60s, right? There's no way to prove that. But I think part of the proof is that the states prevailed and the parties prevailed, and the relationship prevails. So yes, Bertrand.
I'm formerly from the World Bank, and I have a question. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have the perception that the only formal alliance that China had with another country has been with North Korea. And if I'm correct, how would your analysis of emotions and the broader picture, how should we think about that fact that China has no other alliance than North Korea?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. There's no there was a Sino-Soviet alliance, but I think it's been it's the treaty is no longer in effect. The Sino-North Korean alliance treaty has been in effect, and people like I was just at a conference and they were saying that yeah, China doesn't like alliances. They don't really have any alliances, and then I was like, yes they do. They have a formal alliance with North Korea, and it is still on the books, and you can look it up and you can see whether China feels that it's has to honor it, maybe more questionable, but you're right, it's the only country that there is a formal alliance with, and there's a lot of things that I write about in the book that I think you could only really imagine it in the China-North Korea relationship. One thing I talk about in the book is the popularity of this North Korean movie, The Flower Girl, in China during the early 1970s. And it was an incredible phenomenon. And Chinese were all going to the theater and, crying their eyes out cathartically. And, some people say, well, that wasn't really for North Korea. But I say, but name one movie from any other country that had that kind of an impact on China culturally during the Cold War, and that usually quiets them. So yes. Let's go to Sean. Go to Sean, I guess. Yes. We'll make our way over.
Hi, I'm Sean Dolan. I'm the Assistant Programs Director for the Asian Studies Suite here at the Elliott School. You touched on the relationship between Mao and Kim Il-sung, and I'm wondering if you could speak to a little bit what the impact was of Mao's death and how this relationship has still been able to endure despite leadership changes. Now the Kim family is in its third generation, and obviously we've gone through a handful of Chinese leaders there. So how is that relationship still maintained, even though that personal relationship that Kim Il Sung and Mao had is obviously gone?
Right, and I think I do talk about that in the book to a degree. Obviously, Deng Xiaoping's approach to North Korea was somewhat different from Mao's, but I think Deng Xiaoping he still used a lot of the symbolism and friendship of the symbolism of Sino-North Korean friendship in a number of instances. It's sort of the 70s and 80s are a very interesting period in China and North Korea because they're both sort of transitioning. North Korea is placing a much greater emphasis on juche, or self-reliance, during this period, and also that's the era where they decide that they're basically going to become a hereditary dynasty, and Kim Il Sung is going to pass power to his son. But getting China to sort of agree to this or legitimize it was important. And so I talked about the passage of leadership on the North Korean side instead of the Chinese side. But on the Chinese side, I think I think you're right. Mao Zedong was sort of very symbolic. Zhou Enlai was very symbolic, and his widow actually traveled to North Korea where they erected a statue of Zhou. Zhou is extremely popular in North Korea during the 50s and 1960s. And so, yes, the passage of that leadership does augur change. What I try to argue in the book is that the change is not a complete flip or reversal, and that there were some elements of continuity, but there were obviously some elements of discontinuity because China was opening to the West in ways that North Korea wasn't, and whereas they both had sort of economic models that had a lot in common during the 50s and 60s. That divergence also created, I wouldn't say conflict, but it ruined some of the basis for close friendship, because like socialist development and sort of the romance of socialist development during the 1950s and 60s was also something that held them together. So, I think things change with the change of leadership in China. But what I try to demonstrate in the book is that, one, it's not immediate, and that, two, there's still elements of continuity. Thank you. Okay, who should we call on? Can we take David and Celeste? Maybe they can both ask. Yeah.
Okay, David Shambaugh here at the Seeger Center. My question, Greg, is how did both sides, China and North Korea, deal with the death or killing of Mao's son, Mao Yan-shin, in the Korean War? That would have seemed to be a major propaganda opportunity for both sides. I just don't know the answer. I'm curious if you know anything about that. And just an observation, I know your book only goes up to 1965, and I look forward to reading it, but empathy begins to wane after that, I would say, at least on the Chinese side. In China in the 90s, I encountered repeatedly and ever since just a combination of frustration and condescension by Chinese towards North Korea. First, they saw in North Korea their own pre-Deng Xiaoping past, Cultural Revolution, cult of personality, sycophancy, et cetera, et cetera. And the Chinese tried, as you know, repeatedly to get the North Koreans to emulate their economic development model. The North Koreans just refused to do it. They brought them in delegation after delegation after delegation. So if there's any empathy left, I'd say, or maybe it's come back now, you're arguing, but boy, in the 90s and the early 2000s, at least on the Chinese side, nothing but frustration and condescension.
Thanks, Greg, for your talk. I have slightly different counterfactual and comparative questions. So first, how necessary was war to building mutual empathy? If you could imagine the Korean War not there, might this empathy have occurred? And second, in comparative terms, did the emotional work that you're tracking also happen, say, when North Korea sent troops to fight in Vietnam, or more recently when it sent troops to fight in Ukraine?
Yes, first let me go to you. I think David, I think Mao Anying is I think Mao's son who dies during the Korean War. And yes, it was a powerful propaganda opportunity. And we sort of have semi-questionable evidence of Mao's reaction to it, because we have it in sort of the biographies of some of the military personnel who related the decision to him, and we have it in the Mao Zedong Nianpu, I believe. But the generally it's portrayed as he was very sort of stoic about it, and he said Mao Anying's sacrifice was for the good of the North Korean people. He should be buried in North Korea, which he was, as a symbol of North Korean friendship. And I think even recently there was like some Chinese production about Mao Anying, and so that's why I say the empathy is coming back. I think the 90s, you are what I would agree is that the 90s are a low point. They're a low point politically for both China and North Korea, because that is when China sort of commits the ultimate betrayal and recognizes South Korea. And during the 90s, there's very, very strong interest in South Korea. You're right. But I don't think sort of the underlying feelings for North Korea, they're far less prominent, and it's true there's a lot of contempt, but it doesn't, it's not universal. right? There's still people who were former volunteers during the 1990s who would talk about, the good old days in North Korea and how they, bonded with, the North Korean people. And so, my point is not that things don't change and popular sentiment doesn't change, but that that some element of this remains. So that's how I would address that question. Celeste, how necessary was the war? Was war in general for state building? I think
building mutual empathy.
Oh, for building mutual empathy, could they have done it with? Could they have, would they have had mutual empathy without the war? I think the war was critical. I mean, I think North Korea, from the North Korean perspective, their state was almost gone for 3 months, and nobody knew if it was coming back. It wouldn't have without the Chinese volunteer entering the conflict, right? And so when they entered, it really was almost a euphoric moment for North Korea. And there were some, moments of fighting together that were, that really created powerful bonds among people, among the military, between the volunteers and North Koreans. And so, I think the war played a critical role. And also, I talked about sort of North Korean propaganda supporting the volunteers. In China, of course, there was something called the Gangmei Yuanqiao Yundong, where the movement to aid Korea and resist America, where they were really trying to create sentiment in favor of the war. And so, I think the war absolutely in the book is really a crucial mechanism. So that's one thing. And then I'm sorry, I can't read what I wrote when I was. That's the problem. I didn't bring my glasses, so.
It's lessons of emotional work.
With
Vietnam or in Ukraine, do you see echoes of that type of appeal to emotion?
Not to the same degree. I do think there's something unique or distinctive to how China and North Korea relate to each other. I think if there was any parallel, I would say it may be more in how the United States and South Korea sometimes used to talk about each other, but still with a very, very different cultural characteristic. So.
Greg, has been a lot of fun. So those of you wondering what book you're going to read over the summertime as you head to the beach, I want to commend the new book, Cold War Comrades. You could do worse than to read this over the summertime. So please join me in thanking Greg for this great book.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
If you have more questions, now's the time.
Yes, Swarm the author.